Hey friends, I'm really excited to share with you this interview with filmmaker Bernardo Ruiz. He will be speaking with me about his latest documentary, El Equipo, which has been screening around festivals worldwide and is currently screening at Toronto's HotDocs Canadian International Documentary Film Festival. It's an interesting look at forensic science, but also the legacy of Dr. Clyde Snow and specifically El Equipo, or the team of forensic students that are now world-renowned forensic scientists from Argentina. I hope you enjoy this interview. Hola, Bernardo. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Heidi.
Thank you for joining me on this lovely sunny morning I'm in Canada and you are in the US. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm in New York.
Excellent. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work as a documentary filmmaker and your appeal to tell these stories that have to do with human rights issues. But maybe let's just start with sort of what was the impetus of you getting into this career?
I think like a lot of people, I was very interested in, my entry point into film was through fiction film, but I was simultaneously very interested in journalism, independent journalism, and journalism about Latin America. And it really wasn't until about 2000 or so when I realized that those two things could coexist in documentary. So the documentary afforded an opportunity to create films, but also to do journalistic work. And so that's really the impetus for getting into documentary. That and when I started, the documentary industry was very different. And there was it was just a different focus. So I was able to work with and train with a lot of by working with a lot of filmmakers, independent documentary filmmakers.
Right. So having said that, what was sort of that trajectory? Were you working with you mentioned filmmakers, but do you have any experience with editing or working with archival footage yourself? That's part of this film that we're going to talk about.
Yes. So one of the first big opportunities I got in documentary was working for a filmmaker, Orlando Bagwell, who had been one of the filmmakers who'd done the second iteration of Eyes on the Prize, which is a really important series about the Black-led civil rights movement that just worked extensively with archival footage from preceding, during, and after the civil rights era. And that was a series that I had watched as a student and had a big impact on me. It was, in my experience, a lot of archival films could be dry. There's a certain variety of historical documentaries that felt, like an Encyclopedia Britannica, sort of dry. You get the information, but there wasn't much connection there. And for me, Eyes on the Prize, I think for many people, Eyes on the Prize was a revelation, and it just had a big impact on me. So later, when I had an opportunity to work as an associate producer and researcher for Orlando Bagwell on a different series that he was working on, I really jumped at the opportunity, and that was a kind of initial training ground for me. So that was the kind of first experience of learning how to put together these complex stories.
Excellent. So this is El Equipo that's going to be showing here at HotDocs is your fifth feature documentary, correct? So congratulations on that. I know you've taken it to some festivals, and I'm seeing some great reactions on online. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about you reaching out to Mercedes, I understand, first to talk about maybe doing a documentary on the team. What was that like?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I had just finished the first feature documentary I made called Reportero, which was about a group of journalists covering organized crime and political corruption in Tijuana, in Mexico. And I ambitiously wanted to make a film. I heard about and read about the Argentine forensic anthropology team and their work. And I learned through mutual contacts that Mercedes Mimi Doretti, the co-founder of the team, that she was at the time based in New York. So I reached out to her and requested a meeting. And I think honestly, probably pretty arrogantly, because I was younger back then. I thought, I sat down with her and I said, I want to make a film about you and your team. And she, I think, was skeptical and wise to be skeptical. And she said, look, if you're really interested in making a film about us and our work, you should interview Clyde Snow, who was the team's mentor, an American forensic anthropologist. At that time, he was in his early to mid 80s and in poor health and declining health. And I think she said that to me as a kind of test to see if, how committed I was to the story. And that's really what got me started. I mean, it ultimately would take me 10 years to make the film. That has to do with the realities of funding in our world,
Right.
And also the really gaining the trust of the team members over time to be able to interview them and subsequently re-interview them. All worth it, I think, in the end, but it was certainly the beginning of a very long process.
Which is not surprising in terms of documentary filmmaking. I hear that a lot. You have to build the trust from your, the people that you're approaching, but also collecting those stories, which are so important. Clyde Snow, he's a character. He was very respected in the field of forensic science, but also a person that comes across as really passionate about the work and highlighting human rights abuses and other issues. Can you talk about that experience of speaking with him, even if it was sort of when his health wasn't so great?
Yeah, I mean, what you see in the film, what you see in El Equipo is what I experienced. Clyde Snow was very much a larger than life figure. I actually think he kind of cultivated this eccentric personality as a way to help get media attention for these cases that probably wouldn't have gotten attention otherwise. I mean, if you look at what he did in Guatemala, in Argentina, in other countries, he was very skillful at bringing in the media, U.S. media in particular, which, I think like a lot of news outlets tend to focus on sensation or, characters. And so he was very skillful at bringing in the media. So, I mean, he was a very important, piece of the film. Although what I would say for me, the real focus of the film is it's Clyde's relationship to the young anthropologist. And I would, that extends to Freddie Pecorelli, who is now the executive director of the Guatemalan team. There's I think a really beautiful story in that relationship between this aging American forensic anthropologist and these young Latin American and Central American students. And these are relationships that lasted for 4 decades. There was a really kind of a lifelong collaboration. So I think that's really, to me, what's at the heart of the story. Their work in science and in human rights on behalf of families of the disappeared, but their human and kind of personal relationships over that time.
Absolutely. And I think that's what resonated with me as well. I didn't mention this earlier, but I am from Guatemala, so I am familiar with Freddie Pecorelli's work. I follow his work regularly because they do pivotal work. But it's in thanks to this El Equipo that was formed in the 80s in Argentina. So, I kind of want to ask you about working with your editor, your producers, I think it's Gabriela and Fabian, and sort of putting together the array of archival material that you have. I hear interviews, I see visuals, there's documents. And what was that like in terms of putting together this really beautiful story?
Yeah, I mean, I had a very it was a very challenging experience to assemble all of these fragments, and I think all credit really goes to for the kind of editorial construction to Fabian Caballero, who's an Argentine Bolivian editor based here in the United States now. He, is from a younger generation and maybe didn't grow up with that history of the dictatorship necessarily, but which was very interesting. I mean, this is putting together this history that I think some people have seen in different places, but our challenge as filmmakers was to put it all together into one story through the lens of the team. So Fabian is just a very skilled and talented editor, and it was a kind of day-to-day battle to put all of these fragments together into one whole. And then Gabriela Alcalde has deep experience in archival work, both in terms of kind of telling stories through archival footage, and just the practicalities of licensing and getting that material together. So, I picked and was lucky to have very great collaborators on this. And for us, it was really kind of a marathon. It wasn't a sprint. It was really about a kind of longer term investment in putting this together. I would say our big editorial goal was to try to create intimacy, which is why for most of the film, you're only hearing the voices of the team members over archive. And that was really my goal as a director filmmaker there, was just to create as much intimacy as possible. And I personally think there's a kind of way that audio only interviews kind of seep into you in a way that on camera interviews sometimes don't. So that was really what I tried to do there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in terms of giving the voices to those who you want to highlight, and in this case being the members of El Equipo. I kind of want to talk a little bit about El Equipo and sort of, the history that you've given us through the film, but sort of like your own relationship with them now, because you've spent this much time with them, and what was the reaction of them, or how's that reaction evolved now that the film is complete?
It's a great question. One of the things that I have learned about them is that the founding members of the team, who I spent the most time with, they do not like to be in the spotlight. So like journalists, I think, or like, other scientists, they don't enjoy being the center of attention. And their work is very hard, and it's taxing emotionally and physically. And really, they're there to do work on behalf of families for the most part. So they don't really like to be the center of the story. So it really was a long process of bringing them out and getting them comfortable enough to tell the story over time. And I think a lot of filmmakers have this experience where in documentary, where over time people start to get bored of you. You're around so much that they just start to talk to you, and that's usually when the best stuff comes. So I would say in the last few years of this process, the interviews, I think, became more interesting. I had the pleasure of screening this film in The Hague in the Netherlands, where the International Criminal Court is, with two of the founding members, Luis von der Bieder and Maurice Tidball-Bins, who now do international work. I've done work in Ukraine, helping to identify missing persons there in that conflict. And it was a very moving experience watching the film with them. As a filmmaker, you're always nervous when, you're screening. You've made a film about someone's life and you're sitting there watching it with them. It is a nerve-wracking experience, but, in this case, they've really embraced the film. And I think I hope that they see the opportunity for it to educate certainly a whole generation of people unfamiliar with their work and the importance of this kind of work. You think about the political moment we're in, where there is the rise of authoritarian governments, violence against political opposition, in many, many parts of the world, and the need for this kind of accurate documentation of crimes, with a goal of preventing them, that feels more relevant than ever. So, I think I believe the team sees the value of that work. of the
Yeah,
film.
thank you for sharing that, because I was going to ask you about that screening in The Hague. I read about that just the other night. So, speaking of being relevant, the story, a lot of us from Latin America are very well, most of us are aware of the conflicts that have occurred over the decades. And, there are scenes in the film where there's connections about, to how the government in the US has been involved in some of these situations that brought on violence in our birth countries. I'm curious if you've had any sort of public reaction, because I know the film's screened in other festivals, and sort of what that reaction might be in places like in the US.
It's a good question. We haven't had any pushback about what I would say is just documenting the political realities of the story. I mean, these are very well documented histories. If you look at, Chile and Argentina and Guatemala, I mean, the, different aspects of U.S. involvement over the years, it's very clear and it's very well documented. There's not a lot of reasonable debate about the involvement there. I do think what we are prepared for is we will have a national domestic broadcast in the U.S. through the series Independent Lens, which is on public television in the U.S. on PBS. That typically is the biggest domestic audience. We'll screen in October of this year. That's usually, typically it's about 1.5 million viewers through broadcast and streaming. Usually around the broadcast is when, we receive the most feedback.
Right.
So I wouldn't be surprised for the film to generate some debate around that time. But so far in festivals, it hasn't been a point of debate.
Yeah, it's good to hear that. I think it's also priming some of the audiences in terms of, being more informed and sort of being aware of the work that's being done behind the scenes. I know that forensic work is often not mentioned when it comes to, or not as widely recognized perhaps in some main outlets with regards to human rights abuses and advocacy for the families that remain, right? So, when I look at this film, I think of Patricio Guzman also in terms of the documentaries that he does, where he talks about memory and history and, the idea that we shouldn't forget what's happened. And also, how do we move forward, right? Because in this film, we know El Equipo is still working. So, the work still continues to be relevant. Any comments on that and maybe, any last minute reflections?
It's another great question. I obviously I'm, have grown up with the films of Patricio Guzman and feel, he's such a special filmmaker. I think what we're trying to do with this film is, I feel like it's just a great story. It's just a very compelling story. And if you think about, so much of the history of Latin America has been about this very, kind of terrible collaboration between, parts of the US government and Latin American dictators and authoritarians. What I like about this is there's a story of a different kind of collaboration between a US person, in this case Clyde Snow, and Latin Americans. It's kind of a cross-border challenge to the other type of collaboration. And so I think it's a unique and very compelling piece of history. I think it's a very gripping, human story. I also think it is connected to those histories of those films about memory and history, albeit through a kind of character story.
Right.
So I also think it's a history that I think we will see repeated or at least continued. So I do think it's part of an ongoing conversation, especially in a moment of right-wing extremism and authoritarianism.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you so much, Bernardo. I appreciate your time and sharing so much.
Thank you, Heidi. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.